Princess, people come up with.
Well,
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Oh. My name is Henry Werman. I'm chair of the Public Affairs Committee for the Dallas Bar Association. And thank you. I'm Henry Werman, chair of the Dallas Bar Association Public Affairs Committee, and we're here to present what we hope to be a historic and educational program on the rule of law. I'd like to welcome all of you who are here live at the presentation. I'd like to welcome all of you who are on the Zoom, and I'd like to welcome all of you in the future, because we intend to promulgate this video that we're making today to various civic, educational, and academic groups for their use as well. So I hope you enjoyed the program. We have a round of just outstanding speakers. And so without further ado, I will introduce to you the president of the Dallas Bar Association, who will be your moderator today, Vicki Blanton.
good afternoon, everyone. I am so excited to be here today on this most important topic, given all of the current affairs. Again, my name is Vicki Blanton. I am the 116th president of your Dallas Bar Association. We are ever so grateful to the Public Forum Committee for bringing this topic forward. The role of the Public Forum Committee is to think of topics that are of interest, not just to the lawyers, but to the community at large. This helps to bring forward our mission that for the Dallas Bar Association, as our mission goal is to create good relations among the lawyers, the judges, and the community, because it is critical that we have a good relationship with the community, because they have allowed us to be lawyers and they hold us to a certain standard. And so, as many of you, I'm sure, who are lawyers in the room, you know, you have family, you have friends, you have neighbors, and you might be the quote unquote resident expert as the only lawyer that they know. And so, as many of you may have gotten, as I have gotten, whether it's cornered at the family reunion, the cocktail party, and they start with a simple, hey, let me ask you a question, right? And we keep hearing this thing called the rule of law, the rule of law. And to help me walk through that, I have a most distinguished panel here with me, and we will start with brief introductions by each one to tell us who they are and kind of their point of view. So, Chad.
Which Chad?
I knew you were going to say that. That was the in-house joke there. I actually have two Chads. So Chad to my immediate right.
Certainly. My name is Chad Ruback. I'm an appellate lawyer here in Dallas. I was president of the Dallas Association of Young Lawyers back when I was young, which was a long time ago. I am immediate past president of the Mac Taylor Inn of Court. People ask me what my next extracurricular activity will be, and I think it will be just like resting. I am thrilled to be here today. Rule of law is something that's always been very important to me, and I'm honored that they would ask me to join this esteemed panel. I'm feeling imposter syndrome right now. I don't think I belong here.
Oh, without a doubt, you do belong here. As some of you may be familiar with Chad's to my immediate right, and you'll understand the joke much better later, that he often provides commentary on various news programs. So he may look familiar, like, oh yeah, I know that guy. That's because he is often quoted, asked to give commentary on legal issues of the day on various news programs. Thank you for joining us. Dean Furguson.
My name is Royal Furguson. I was a practicing lawyer for 24 years, then a judge for 19 years. I then was the dean of the founding dean of UNT Dallas College of Law, retired from that job, and have now been mediating and arbitrating cases here in Dallas. I've always felt like the law is sort of the centerpiece of my life, and I've devoted my life to it, and so I'm delighted to be here to talk about it. Thank you.
If anyone can take us to school, it would be the founding dean of the University of North Texas Dallas School of Law that's here downtown. So thank you so much for joining us, Dean. And so now for the punchline of the joke, Chad, if you would introduce yourself.
So I'm Chad Baruch. I'm an appellate lawyer here in Dallas. Been doing that for a very long time, and for a long time, for 25 years, also was a college and high school basketball coach and political science professor and government teacher. And I'm particularly proud, and for reasons that will become apparent in a few minutes, to say that I am the only Jewish lawyer ever in the 120-year history of the State Bar of Texas to serve as its president or chair.
That is quite an accomplishment. Wow. And certainly as you hear the rest of Chad's story, as we progress through the program, you'll have an even deeper appreciation for his comment. The other thing that I also realize is that is Chad Baruch and Chad Ruback. You switch the B and the R and it's almost the same name. So it was an interesting job being the moderator of this panel.
I'm the real Chad.
Long as there are no hanging chads here. All right. So really let's get down to the meat of it. So I'm hearing rule of law, rule of law. What is that? What does that mean? Whoever wants to jump in first.
Sure. Well, it's there's no definition, right? I mean, that's, as Justice Kennedy famously said, the rule of law is, how did he put it? Often invoked and seldom defined. And I think that's exactly right. And oftentimes our perspectives depend on our definitions. So we define it differently and then yell at other people for not following the rule of law as we define it, but not necessarily as they define it. I went pretty deep into the weeds on this and read a lot. And the best article I found was by Bob Stein, who is the former president of the American Bar Association and was my law school dean. And he cited 8, he sort of surveyed the literature and the discussion of this concept going back centuries. And he cited 8 concepts that he thought formed the rule of law. And I'll just really quickly share those with you. Superiority of the law, which is just a fancy way of saying the law applies to everyone. No one's above the law. Separation of powers, that all political power is not concentrated in a single person or group. The law should be known and predictable. It should be equally applied. It should be just in that it is designed to protect citizens rather than limit or persecute citizens. It should be accessible. There should be robust and accessible enforcement. There should be an independent judiciary, and there should be a right to participate in the process. Those are the 8 things he characterized as the pillars of the rule of law. And then he added 2 more that he thought might belong. One was an independent legal profession in addition to an independent judiciary. And the other was sort of an access to justice element, the ability to utilize the system within your economic means. In other words, that it's not available only to the wealthy. So that would be probably as best, I think, a bundling of the concepts as I could think of or find as to what constitutes the rule of law. And by the way, it raises some immediate questions, right? I mean, this is something I raised with the group a couple of weeks ago. The first thing that jumped out at me on the equal application is all of us are talking about the rule of law right now as though it's something that has existed for all of our citizens previously. And I think when you listen to what I just said, you immediately form the conclusion that we probably have some things to answer for in terms of the availability of the rule of law to all of our citizens going back many, many years. So
That's a good concept. But then you hear all of these fancy terms, right? And I'm speaking of this again because it's a public forum and we as lawyers get used to throwing them around depending on your practice area, maybe some more than others, but due process, habeas corpus, all of these kind of fancy, some of them Latin terms. Where does that fit in with the rule of law?
Very well. As Chad indicated, it's tough to define the rule of law. Different people have different definitions of it. I like the definition that he used. Not everyone's going to agree with that definition, but even if you were to, get everyone on the same page with that definition, people aren't going to necessarily agree with the application of that definition. One of them, as I remember, he said was, there should be, justice or fairness. I mean, well, okay, that's in the eye of the beholder. It's kind of like defining pornography. There's not a bright line test as to what it is or what it isn't. I wish there were. How can we address these other terms such as, such as the ones used by Vicky, habeas corpus, for example. Well, those are all part and parcel with the rule of law.
Again, for the non-lawyers, what does habeas corpus mean?
It's Latin for something like bring the body here. It basically is, if someone is someplace that they don't want to be, habeas corpus is a process by which the courts can bring that person there. We've probably seen a bit in the news recently about a gentleman who was taken out of the country against his will, and maybe shouldn't have been, and was recently brought back in this country. Habeas corpus is a procedure by which someone who's taken someplace or held someplace against their will can be brought before a court to seek legal redress. Is that sort of kind of close? Okay.
That's what I was going for.
You know, I like Chad's recitation of the rule of law. The American Bar Association has a distillation of it, which I think is helpful. It has 4 elements: a system of self-government in which all persons, including the government, are accountable under the law. All persons are accountable under the law. Number 2, a system based on fair, publicized, broadly and understood and stable laws. Number 3, a fair, robust, and accessible legal process in which rights and responsibilities based in law are evenly enforced. And number 4, diverse, competent, and independent lawyers and judges. And I like that definition. It's a little bit of a distillation of what Chad shared with us. When you talk about the law, I really like Thomas Paine's statement about the law when he wrote Common Sense before we signed the Declaration of Independence. And here's what he said. So far as we approve of monarchy, that in America the law is king, for as in absolute governments the king is law, so in free countries the law ought to be king. And I've always liked that. I really think it was sort of the watchword of what we were going to do when we created our country. In a monarchy, the king is law. In a democracy, the law is king. And I always liked how Thomas Paine sort of set the foundation for what we were going to be doing in our nation, and the fact that we were going to be serious about the law being our king. So thank you, Vicki, for letting me throw that in.
That is a fantastic saying. I wrote that down. The king is law as opposed to the law is king. I think those are watchwords, simple watchwords that we could all embrace as we go on this rule of law journey for us. And we think about, there was a great exhibit at the Bush Center, if any of you have had the opportunity to go to the Presidential Center, about, and the big banner was Freedom Matters. And they had one of the last existing copies of the Magna Carta. And they had all of these terms on the wall. So it really brought to home what our expression of the rule of law is. But let's get even deeper. We can't stop there. What is the rule of law not?
I think the rule of law is not where everybody's accountable. In other words, nobody gets a pass, so everybody is accountable. And so if we have a system where somebody isn't accountable under the law, then my view is that means that there is not a real rule of law. That would be my first thought. Chad, I'll throw it to you.
So I just got all distracted because I saw my friend Hishon walk in and sit down next to my former principaling colleague, by the way. So we were, the gentleman over here, Tim Clout, we were assistant principals together for 15 years. And he's the only other person who knows the truth of this story. When we got our beautiful new campus, and it was heavily secured, as you can imagine, being a Jewish school, we all got a 24/7 pass card and a little name badge, and your name badge was, your position was abbreviated by the first 3 letters of your job. And I'm not kidding you, Tim and I both got name cards, and they both said ass on them, because we had to get new ones, and my 35-year-old son still has mine to this day because he, so.
Hey, by the way, will Tim tell us what your record was as a basketball coach?
He won't, he was a poetry teacher. Undefeated.
Undefeated.
Well said. So
Theoretically, I am actually congratulated for his basketball record, and I take those congratulations and smile and say thank you.
here's what I focus on, and let me back up and sort of give my perspective, or maybe why I was invited to be on the panel. So my perspective is a very different one in the sense that the house I grew up in with, this was not a theoretical discussion. My father had lived through the collapse of the rule of law. My dad and my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. And when I say they saw the collapse of the rule of law, I'm being both literal and figurative. I mean, I think of them sitting in their apartment on the 3rd floor of downtown Hamburg, Germany, watching Kristallnacht on the street below. And they were literally watching the rule of law collapse around them in what had been an incredibly vibrant democracy to that point, right? So when I was growing up, these discussions were quite immediate. I was a very, I'm going to overshare here, a very fearful child because of what my family had gone through. I mean, I've just lived most of my life in fear. I don't mind sharing with you. I hate nighttime. I hate it. I hate the dark. I've never been able to sleep in the dark. I've spent my whole life waiting for someone to break in my door and take me away. I just can't explain. It's almost like that fear is genetically passed from generation to generation. And my dad, when I was very young, to mostly probably calm me the hell down at night and get me to go to sleep, would tell me about that this could not happen in America. And there was one reason it couldn't happen to America, because there were magic people called judges who would not allow them to do that to me. That's why I became a lawyer. As I got older and understood what judges meant, and that you had to have a special person called a lawyer to talk to a judge. That's the whole reason I am in the law, is this idea. And so at least for me, when you talk about what is the rule of law not, I'm always laser focused on the independent judiciary. That in my heart, that's where the rule of law resides. It's important for the political branches to honor their oaths, you know, stay within the law. I get all that, but I'm gonna like cry when I say this. It's just because anytime I talk about my dad, I cry. Everybody knows that. I've just depended on them. I guess that's the only way I can say it. I've felt safe in my life only because of the independent judiciary in America. So that's where and there's lots of discussions about what that means and when is it independent and when is it not, because remember, as I tell people all the time, the courts functioned great in Nazi Germany with really good judges. And in 95% of the cases, they were deciding them exactly the same as we would decide them here, right? There was only a small handful of cases that were affected by the politics of the day. But if you noticed a few weeks ago, some of you may have seen some of the news stories about the very young American girl who was executed in Germany. She was from Milwaukee, had gone over there to work on a master's degree, got active in the anti-Hitler movement, was caught, and a court sentenced her to, I believe, 16 years in prison. And Adolf Hitler overruled the sentence and had her executed. So that kind of shows you that while they had a functioning judiciary, it was not an independent judiciary. So that's my extremely long-winded answer to your very focused question.
Chad, want to add something?
I think he said it all. Actually, I'm a fan of the rule of law without nearly as good a story as Chad has. I mean, mine is just, as a practicing lawyer, as a practicing appellate lawyer, I like seeing courts be independent, and they get it right almost all the time. The 5% of cases that Chad mentioned about occurring in Nazi Germany, where there was someone to just take the case away from the court if You say the executive branch didn't think the court got it right. I mean, those are the 5% that we're trying to protect against with our rule of law. It's, it's not the 95% that we're worried about. It's the 5%. And frankly, even if, 1 in a million cases that judges get things really, really wrong, and it does happen, very, very rarely, but occasionally the courts just get things really wrong. But the executive branch, whether it was 1940s Germany or 2020s United States, shouldn't just be able to overrule the judiciary just because the executive claims that the judiciary got it wrong. Even if the judiciary does get it wrong in 1 in a million chances, you still can't have rule of law if the executive can decide, I just don't agree with the judges, so I'm going to decide it differently myself.
Could I say one other thing? I think lawyers are an independent lawyer independent lawyers are incredibly important to the rule of law. Everything starts with the lawyers. If the lawyers don't show up, nothing really happens. And having an independent legal community of lawyers, I think, is crucial to the rule of law. I've always admired, lawyers, especially in the defense lawyers in the criminal context. I was a judge for 19 years, and the whole power of the federal government is on one side of the courtroom, and they're the lone defendant with one lawyer is on the other side. And yet it's an even fight because of lawyers, because that defense lawyer is standing there for his client or her client, really with the full sort of force of their personality to fight for that client. And I've always been impressed about how important that is, to have lawyers standing up for their clients with the only thing that is important to that lawyer is that client. It's it. It's just that client, and their duty and responsibility is 100% to that client. And so when you have the full force of the government coming down on you, it's the lawyer that stands up for you. And I've always been impressed about how important and how special that is in our system of government. Thank you.
I think I would add something to that. I mean, that's a really good point. And before I add this, I was explicitly told by everyone else on this panel to say this. Everything in my life is a reference point to Nazi Germany. So don't read anything into that. I'm not comparing 2025 America to 19 like that. We could be talking about kumquats and lug wrenches, and I would be talking about Nazi Germany, because that's the prism I view everything in my life through, right? But that's what the point Judge Furguson makes. It is interesting to note the very first group Hitler sought to silence was criminal defense lawyers, because he knew if anyone was going to have the gumption to oppose him. And the second group actually he went after was Catholic priests. He went after the criminal defense lawyers and the Catholic priests first. So I think that underscores the importance of what Judge Furguson is saying.
And we got to remember, everybody knows Shakespeare said, the first thing we do, we kill the lawyers. Well, that's in context. Those are a bunch of conspirators wanting to set up a tyranny in England. And so to be successful and to really be able to set up that tyranny in England, the first thing we do, we kill the lawyers. And so that quote often gets misplaced. But Shakespeare was right. If you want to start messing with a democracy, the first thing you do is you get rid of the lawyers.
And I cannot also help but note there was another dictator who decided to kill all people wearing glasses because they knew those people read. True. So as I looked across the panel, thank you so much, Chad, for sharing your personal family history and what that means for you. As the Black person on this panel, I know the significance of what the rule of law has done for me and my community. And as was referenced earlier in the panel, just because we have not always achieved the ideal of the rule of law does not mean that we don't necessarily continue to strive for that ideal, because that is what made the difference for all of us to be able to be here together at the Arts District Mansion. So thank you for sharing that very personal story. Now, as we move forward in our discussion, though, again, I'm just, average citizen. I'm walking around every day. Of course, for the lawyers, as Judge Furguson pointed out, we stand on the line. We stand at the forefront. We're the boots on the ground. We're the first line of defense. The lawyers understand the great, great significance of what it means to stand on the rule of law. For example, I was having dinner with a friend of mine, a non-lawyer, and we were talking about a couple of years ago issues of the day. And I immediately started like crying. No, we don't see. And I'm sitting there at a restaurant in public, crying, like literally bawling, crying out, "This is a democracy." Well, the poor waiter thought I was being broken up with at the table and was like, "Do you want more bread?" So, but for the average citizen, what does that mean? Why should I care? I'm just trying to pay my bills. I'm a business owner. I just want to get my deal done. I just want to do my contracts. Why is all of this bubbling down to this ideal?
It's like the frog in the water that keeps getting warmer and warmer and warmer. We might think, okay, this is not ideal, but I've got other stuff to deal with. I've got plenty of other stuff to deal with. I got my work stuff. I got my family stuff, have all sorts of other obligations. Maybe some things that are happening in the world, whether in this country or elsewhere, it's not ideal, but yeah, we can live with it. But if it keeps going up 1 degree, 1 degree, 1 degree, next thing you know, it's okay, I'm burning to death here. I don't want to ever be in a spot where I'm burning to death because I didn't notice it kept going up 1 degree, 1 degree, 1 degree here and there.
Well, I've always been impressed at how our economic life depends so much on contracts. I mean, I don't know of any company that really can't make it work unless that company has contracts for supplies and to sell and to do all sorts of stuff. And you talk, I always think about Russia, where a contract really doesn't mean anything if Mr. Putin decides it's unimportant to him. But in our country, contracts are sort of fundamental to our economic life. You can depend on a contract, and if a contract is broken, you can have a remedy for that. I believe that one of the reasons we have such a vibrant economy in America is because we believe in law and we believe in contracts, and we believe that if you have a contract, you can enforce a contract. And I think that brings enormous stability into economic life. And so my view is, Vicki, that if people think about it, they would understand how important law is to make sure that that contracts are enforced, in every facet of our capitalistic system. So that was my thought.
So I'm not so sure. It seems
We have a controversy.
no, it seems to me that one of the lessons we take away from many, not all, but from many dictators is the effectiveness of providing basic needs to impoverished people, right? I mean, think about, I'm trying to think of a good example. Think about Juan and Eva Perón in Argentina. And what they did, or what they were perceived to be doing for the poor. And they were able to do wildly horrific things and commit terrible atrocities and remain beloved because the perception was that they were helping poor people secure basic needs like food. Huey Long, I mean, there are people in Louisiana. I mean, Huey Long essentially became the dictator of an American state in the 20th century. You know, that's pretty remarkable. And there are people over there who still worship him because he secured basic needs for poor people. And so I think it's easy to say, well, if they just understood, but I'm not so sure that's right. I've never been poor, thank God, in my life. I don't know what it's like, but I suspect that abstract discussion or even non-abstract, even well-reasoned explanations of the importance of the rule of law. I don't know how important that would be to me if I were figuring out how to feed my children. I just am not sure it is. We obviously education's a big part of it, but I think probably if we could do better on issues like, food stability, I think those things also help support the rule of law. The more stable and secure a society is, I think in those respects, the more likely it is that the rule of law is going to be stable and supported as well. That's just my take on it. But again, I don't know the answer to that because I've just never had to be in that situation. Thank God.
My parents were greatly impacted by the Depression to support your argument. And my father would never take anything on credit or anything. He had to pay for everything. So you're right that conditions can be so severe that nothing makes any difference except food.
I think there's some real truth to that if we can do better at including everyone in the strength of our economy, it will improve the rule of law as well. And you can see that through American history, right? At stressful times, that's when the rule of law gets stressed. And those stresses may come in the form of economic conditions, or they may come in the form of war. I mean, when was habeas suspended? I mean, Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas, right? And law professors are still arguing 150 years later about whether he had the authority to do it or not. But I think that was true during the Great Depression. When you talk about, for example, executive orders, right? The topic of the day. Who signed more than any of them by an astonishing margin was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He signed almost 2,000 executive orders because he was dealing with extreme economic, and by the way, many of which were unquestionably beyond his legitimate power. I mean, way beyond, right? But no one challenged him. Actually, most of the really big ones that plainly stepped all over congressional authority, Congress was fine with it because of the exigencies of the day. And then you fast forward 6 years into a different world and President Truman tries to do the exact same thing. I mean, people don't know this. He takes over the steel industry, right? And the mills, and the Supreme Court says, oh, we can't do that. And he's going, FDR just did it 6 years ago. Like he had just seized all the aviation manufacturing facilities, and the court's going, too bad, so sad. You're president at the wrong time. So there's no question, I think, that those types of exigencies and national sort of periods of deep pathology affect the rule of law and its stability. Just my 2 cents.
I'm just going to push back a little bit on the needs of the day. While I understand your argument in a sense that the reality is I'm trying to put food on the table, but the rule of law is what ensures, again, reaching for that ideal, that those resources get spread across equitably, right? Because there are whole communities that don't get served because it just depends on who's in the position to decide that you get the rule of law today and you don't, right? Whether it's a 6-year period that's passed, whether you look one way versus another, whether you have a zip code here versus another. So I think we cannot let the exigencies of the day pull us away from always striving towards the ideal. If we do that, then we've somewhat lost already.
I agree with that. I mean, I think it's aspirational and we're always moving toward it. And I don't mean to overstate this, but I do think there's a legitimate sort of, and this is the test to some degree the Supreme Court uses for executive orders, that there's an ebb and flow depending on circumstance at times between all sorts of concepts like judicial deference to the executive branch, trying to think of a good okay, here's a good example here. And maybe this will make it clear because I certainly don't, your point is the correct one on the whole, right? Think of the pandemic orders. And the way the US Supreme Court treated, I'm thinking particularly of the challenges to church services that came right at the beginning and right at the end of the pandemic and how differently the United States Supreme Court treated them. And I think our own Supreme Court in Texas actually wrote an opinion about this later saying, look, when we're dealing with emergency executive orders, we may treat them differently early on when we're confronted with the unknown than we may treat them later on where we have a great deal more information at our disposal. So in the earliest days of the pandemic, when we were not certain how COVID was spread or if it was treatable, I mean, we're talking like the very first weeks of the pandemic, that case came to the US Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court blessed all of those restrictions on houses of worship, right? Yes, you can do all those things. By the end of the pandemic, where we had a much better handle on how it was and was not transmitted, mitigating steps, we understood there were masks could be, at that point, the court treated it very differently and said, okay, now we have a great deal more information and we're unwilling to be, in other words, it wasn't about the rule of law so much as it was about deference toward the executive. And they said, we were willing to be more deferential early, but as we get more information, now we're sort of coming back up to even water level to our role as the independent judiciary and not showing so much deference. So I think that's really all. I don't disagree with your point. I'm just saying, I think when you're in the weeds, sometimes would Lincoln's order be more apt to pass muster in the middle of the Civil War than perhaps in peacetime? Yeah, I would think so. Maybe it shouldn't pass muster at any time, but I think those sort of context to me matters, at least to some degree.
But I think your point, your explanation goes to another aspect of the rule of law that we have embraced, which is a separation of powers, right? There's not the full concentration of making all of the decisions in one area, one person, one place. We have the three branches, which, sad to say, so many Americans cannot name all three branches of government. We know your high school football coach in his off season is doing the best he can to teach civics. As most of us, that's how we learned our high school civics.
Now we can't be too hard.
Wait a minute. I taught civics and coach sports.
Said football coach, you were a basketball coach, Chad.
You were a basketball coach. I specifically said that because mine was the football coach.
But that's an interesting, this is way off the subject, but I was close to a principal, a really close friend of mine. And he said, you know, people don't understand how important coaches are in education. They bring a lot of discipline into, they bring the rule of law often
Exactly.
into schools. And he said, so I'm just wanting to stand up for coaches a minute here.
My grandfather was a high school coach, a winning state championship coach.
Okay.
So and he coached everything, not just football. He coached everything.
Right.
But the point being, but the point being is that, most folks get, if, and I don't even know that it's required anymore, but it's the one semester of civics. That's not that particular teacher's primary subject matter expertise, that they're cramming into a bunch of high school students anyway, that probably don't want to be there, and trying to understand this. And, I don't know what this generation is doing without Schoolhouse Rock to teach them the preamble of the Constitution. No, true. I just read a survey. Oh, we the people. I can do it. But here's the point. They said that less than 50% of people know the first three words of the Constitution are "we the people." They couldn't identify it at all, period. So we're starting with the ideal that, again, is for we the people who can't even name it. So what does the separation of powers do to support the rule of law?
I could hardly wait for this question.
I knew.
I was, because it takes us to maybe the most known Federalist paper. Federalist paper number 51, written by James Madison. And this is, to me, it's it's the beginning and the end of the Federalist Papers. But I love this when he says, let me get to here. If men were angels, this is probably something that we all had drummed into us at some point, either in law school or somewhere. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. And that is the fundamental principle of the separation of powers. And of course, it wasn't Madison's idea to begin with. It came from a French philosopher, but it has been the bedrock of our government, of the operation of the three branches, the separation of powers. So thank you, Vicki, for giving me that opening. I could hardly wait for that.
Of course.
Okay.
I mean, we've had some discussion about executive powers being checked really by the judiciary. Where is the Congress in all of this?
Well, it's interesting. Madison was ready for that. He said, let's see. Oh, come on. This is such small print. But he basically said the most important branch was the Congress. And so he thought that the Congress, as an absolute negative on the legislature, appears at first view to be the natural defense with which the executive magistrate should be armed. Perhaps it would be neither altogether safe nor alone sufficient. On ordinary occasions, it might not be exerted with the requisite firmness, and on extraordinary occasions, the executive might be perfidiously abused. At any rate, Madison was ready for all of it. He knew everything about what was going to happen here 250 years later. So I give it to you.
Oh, thank you, Chad.
Yeah, I mean, that raises a couple thoughts for me. One that, and your question is a great one, because when we look at these exercises of presidential power, particularly through the orders, that is really the question the courts focus on. The test from Youngstown Steel turns on that allocation, the separation of powers between the executive and the legislative branch. That's the core of the test for deciding when an executive order is permissible and when it isn't. But it raises some really intriguing questions for me, one of which is, and I guess this just has to do with my fairly unhealthy obsession with Marbury, but I often wonder whether Marbury reduces the burden of the political branches to follow the Constitution. In other words, I know they take an oath to uphold and defend, but one of the sort of central tenets of Marbury, and one of the debates, of course, behind Marbury was, yes, there were the people on the other side weren't saying the judicial branch didn't have the power to interpret the Constitution. What they were saying was they didn't have any special power above the other two branches, that the three branches enjoyed equal power to decide what the Constitution meant. And of course, Marbury sweeps that argument to the curb permanently and says, no, we'll get you're welcome to your opinions, but we'll have the final say. And I've spent a lot of time, particularly over the last 5 months, as these executive orders have come out, thinking about whether there's a legitimate argument to be made that Marbury sort of frees the executive and legislative branches. I don't mean to suggest to violate the Constitution. That's not what I'm saying. But maybe there's a greater zone of argument that they can push the envelope a little further. If there's not clear Supreme Court precedent, maybe that entitles them to say, you know what, this one's in a gray area. Let's put it out there, and the Supreme Court can always tell us we're wrong. Again, there's a line, right? I'm not suggesting that you can just willy-nilly issue executive orders violating the Constitution and count on the court to, that's not what I'm saying. I'm simply saying that I do think there's a legitimate argument to be made that if you don't have binding precedent rejecting it, you can maybe sign it and let the court tell you you're wrong. And I would just give everybody a little bit of a historical lens on this, because I think there's sort of a misperception that this is a recent development. You know, President Washington issued multiple executive orders, and one of them was one of them like brought, you know, James Madison screaming out of the front door of his house. He was so furious over it. So, you know, this is not a new phenomenon. And just to give you an idea, the top 3 issuers are Roosevelt at nearly, I had it wrong, nearly 4,000 executive orders, Woodrow Wilson at nearly 2,000, and Calvin Coolidge at 1,200. Those are your top 3. To give you some idea of where that ranks, President Trump in his first term signed 220. 220. At the pace.
He needs to really step up his game.
Right. Now, this term, of course, I believe we're up already. I think in the first 5 months, I think it's 157 last time I looked. So it's a much, but even just think about that for a minute. And that pace is not going to continue because, of course, they had many, many, many orders ready to go the day he took office. So it's a little misleading. But even if he kept that pace up, he would not eclipse the person at the top of the list. FDR. So this is not, and I don't mean this in any way to sort of suggest a position either way on any of these orders. All I'm saying is, I think a lot of people are mistakenly believing this is a recent issue, and it is definitely not a recent issue. The peak of the use of this power actually was toward the middle of the middle century. I will show you, before I shut up, I'll share with you one thing that I love about it. Was actually President Clinton's chief of staff, I believe, who said, "Stroke of the pen, law of the land." Pretty cool, man.
But to give context, FDR served more terms than any other president, and they quickly then came in with an amendment to limit the amount of presidential terms.
Absolutely.
So, you know, there was a lesson learned there. Let's take that.
That amendment may or may not apply, you know, that's open to interpretation, right?
I'm not taking that bait. So,
You know, Vicki, I know you have an outline. One of the things that I think, as we are very proud of our country and the foundation of our country, we have not done a good job over time of observing the rule of law. The South is a good point in reference. How many lynchings occurred over 30 or 40 or 50 years after slavery, without any accountability in this country? I always admired Maury Maverick. During Roosevelt's administration, the Northern Democrats wanted an anti-lynching law. The Southern Democrats didn't, and Roosevelt wouldn't support it. There was only one Southerner who voted for that anti-lynching law, and that was Maury Maverick. And he was a one-term representative because he got voted out of office the next time around. So, you know, we have a great deal of pride in our country, but there are times when we really failed the rule of law badly, and we have to certainly acknowledge that. Fair to acknowledge it is just myopic in so many ways. So at any rate, I felt like that had to be said somewhere in this discussion.
certainly. And it's interesting that you would raise it again as we are about approaching Juneteenth, the holiday of June 19th, that we have always observed in my family before it became the law, a federal holiday a couple of years ago. And if you are not from Texas, one of the commentaries always is, why would you celebrate getting freed late? And I've never really understood that discussion until recently, this whole spate of executive orders, and realizing, even after having seen the Emancipation Proclamation in the National Archives and reading it, it will also be the last copy that General Granger had at Galveston, that read at Galveston, will be on display at the Hall of State beginning Juneteenth through the State Fair of Texas. So if you actually want to see it, you can actually see the copy. They're one of the last remaining original copy that General Granger brought to Texas that will be here. And I've never understood that until now, to say, oh, okay, now I get it, in the sense that it was an executive order. Why should I have to follow that? In addition to the Confederacy, I'm a whole other country, much less, I just don't want to do that. So this is a very, very dynamic discussion that impacts us each more personally, as Chad B. Baruch has shared his family history about the rule of law, as I know how it has personally impacted my family and how I'm able to be here today. It is something like the air. It's around us, but we don't know it and notice it or care about it until it gets polluted. So again, to that point, if it's so important to us for our way of life, for our government, for us as American citizens, and even the world as they look to America, the United States of America, to uphold this standard, as the average citizen, what can I do? As the lawyer, what should we be doing? What's our opportunity to continue to stand by and protect this rule of law?
Don't be silent. I mean, don't just shrug and say, I've got other stuff to do today. If you see something that's just, as Chad said before, there's a line and everyone might perceive that line, a slightly different place. But if you see something as a serious overreach, speak up. It does concern you. I know you have a lot of things in your world, as do we, but speak up. I know that it's not considered polite to discuss anything even remotely political, but do it anyway. I mean, if there's something that's just serious overreach, not just a close call, not just, well, maybe a toes on the line, but if something is just a really serious violation of what you perceive to be the rule of law, discuss it with people, get it on people's radar screens.
Well, one of the things I think is remarkable about America, I hope I don't seem too much of a cheerleader here, is that we volunteer more than the people in any other country. I think something like 8% of our people are always volunteering, and then there's a smaller number that aren't a part of volunteer efforts. In other countries, it barely gets above 1%. I actually think that being a part of a community, having relationships with other people in a church or a nonprofit or whatever, is really important to the health of our country, because it puts us in touch with people that don't share necessarily our views. And I think it's healthy to be in touch with people who don't share our views. And so I believe we ought to be out there. We ought to be in our churches, our synagogues, or parishes. We ought to be volunteering for the United Way. We ought to be doing those things that get us out of our rut and get us out of our echo chamber. I think that's important, because people keep saying, well, we all really agree more than we think we do. Well, the way to really test that is to get out and be with people who don't agree with us on some of these issues, to see if we can bridge some gaps. It probably doesn't promote the rule of law completely, but it makes for a healthier nation. Your turn, big guy.
I have a long list. I know you're all shocked because I've been so quiet to this point. Those are excellent points. I think those are phenomenally great points, actually. And mine are not as smart as those, but here's my list nevertheless. Number one, defend institutions. I think we as lawyers have a very special role to play with our fellow citizens in helping them to understand the way our system works and the importance of institutions. It's not just judges. I feel like what we're seeing is an attack on institutions themselves. And that doesn't mean that they're always right and the critics are always wrong. That's plainly not true. I have my own, issues with a lot of what I see in the media, and I'm not rejecting that as a narrative. I'm just saying we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so, but I think if we're going to, and particularly though, defend judges, because they are so generally incapable of defending themselves. They're not allowed. They can't speak, right? And so they need us to step forward and defend them. Now, let me be very clear about that. That doesn't mean if we're defending the notion of an independent judiciary, that means all of them, right? Not just the ones we like. We don't defend the 9th because we like it and attack the 5th or whatever, or the 3rd because or whatever, right? Years ago in New Orleans, I was speaking on this topic, and wonderful trial lawyer. Many of you probably know Dickie Grigg, one of the great trial lawyers in all of Texas. I made a comment that if you've ever referred to the Texas Supreme Court as being bought and paid for, you're just as guilty as the people you're criticizing. And he came over to me after me. He's like, "Oh my gosh, I've said that 100 times and I swear I will never, ever say it again as long as I live." He's like, "I never realized I'm being just like them," right? We have to defend all of our judges, and particularly our federal judges in the independent judiciary. That to me is number one. Number two, many more of you need to join my political party, the Goose Gander Party, right? By which I mean, if you're going to adopt a position, be consistent, apply it across the board. Don't flip-flop based on the politics. I see both sides right now so flippy-floppy based on this nationwide injunctions issue is the perfect example of that, right? Boy, we love them when they work for what we're against, and then they're the worst thing ever. How can one judge have that much power? And both sides are doing it, right? I won't go into any more detail, but I think all of you understand exactly what I'm talking about, that both sides have been using these strategically, and it just seems to depend on whose ox is being gored. I don't think that's maybe it's lawyerly to take both sides of the issue, but only if you're being paid, right? It's not lawyerly to flip-flop otherwise. So that's my 2, is be consistent. My 3 is when you encounter incendiary language on social media, join the conversation and tamp down the language. Nothing aggravates me more than to see a lawyer dive into a social media discussion and turn the temperature up rather than down. Again, not a lawyerly thing to do. Be lawyerly. I think we can all do better at appreciating nuance and context. We don't just lump all executive orders together. Kristen can't do that. Well, yeah, and about 80% of them easily are pretty non-controversial, and he can. We need to be more focused and lawyerly in our analysis. Okay, I've got 2 more. I'm almost done, I swear. Understand the difference, the critical difference, as you explain this to citizens, between undermining the rule of law and violating the rule of law. Those are so different, and nothing points that out better. Drove me nuts, the number of lawyers who posted that the president was violating the rule of law by pardoning the January 6 people. I was like, how can he be violating the rule of law by exercising a power afforded to him by the United States Constitution? Now, he may arguably be doing it in such a way that it will undermine the rule of law. That's a different conversation. That's a political conversation we can have, but he's not violating the rule of law. He's allowed to do that under the Constitution. That's the point I'm making. And again, if we as lawyers don't draw those lines, how in the heck are we going to expect anyone else to do it? And the last thing I will say, and this is very close to what Judge Furguson said, I still continue to believe that the less poverty you have in a society, the stronger the rule of law is going to be. Because people who have a secure means of income, a secure food supply, a secure roof over their heads are far more likely to engage in a discussion now about a concept like the rule of law. You have to secure those basic level needs to have that second level discussion. And so everything Judge Furguson said, I look at people like Mark Melton, and I think in his own way, he's contributing enormously to the rule of law in our part of the country. So that's my list.
Outstanding.
Thank
Well
you.
done. Well done.
My thoughts on it, though, to the point that you were saying about if everyone is secure, but the reality is everyone isn't. Everyone isn't. We don't have to go too far from this building where we are right now. We could step right outside and we would know everyone isn't secure. But what the rule of law does afford is everyone an opportunity to participate in the process. And I think it is incumbent upon us to continue to shout as much as we can, participate, vote, engage, write to your congressman, go sit down at the courthouse. Our courts are open. That's really quite unique in many parts of the world, that you can even air your grievances publicly, that you have a jury of your peers, go serve at jury duty. It is incumbent upon all the citizenry to participate in the process to make it work towards the ideal for the haves and the have-nots. So that's my what can we do? Now I'm going to end on this note. If any of the hour that we've talked about hasn't provoked you, invoked you to want to engage, what happens if we don't? What happens if we don't protect the rule of law? And we're going to work in the same order, because I really want Chad B to tell his story of his family's journey, if he's willing to share that today. Because here's the thing, there was a point in time in that moment in history where everyone said, oh, it's not that bad. That's just those folks over there. That's some political thing over there. I'm not involved in politics. I'm not engaged in those. I'm just trying to go to work every day, pay my mortgage, get my kids off to school, have a little business, and I have my little secure spot in the world. But Chad R., what happens if we don't continue to engage and support the rule of law in your mind?
We're in trouble. If we lose the rule of law, and some countries historically have lost it in a period of just a few years, if we lose the rule of law, I mean, what do we have? I mean, really, truly, what do we have? What makes America a great country? What makes it even a livable country? Among the many, many important values we have in this country, I can't think of any that should be paramount to rule of law.
Can I say one thing we haven't talked about? And as a trial lawyer, I really respected juries. As a judge, I came to understand how foundational juries are to our whole justice system. And when Americans think about the law, so many times they think about the jury trial. They think about, that's the way the law works. It's in front of a jury. We have a Sixth and Seventh Amendment, right to trial by jury in criminal cases, right to trial by jury in civil cases. And in so many ways, I think it's just the foundation of what we do as judges and lawyers. And we talk about an independent judiciary, we talk about independent lawyers, but in America, when the rubber hits the road, we do justice with juries. I mean, it's just, that's what it is. And for somebody who saw almost 300 juries work through my whole career, we are so lucky that we embrace juries, because it's the wisdom of our people. And as someone who watched juries time after time not want to be there, doing everything they could to get out of the service, and then sitting on the jury and being so conscientious and really so empowered by what they were doing, I think we have to understand in America, juries are very critical. And when we talk about judges standing up or lawyers standing up, it's often the jury that stands up and says, this isn't right, and this has to be done differently. So at any rate, before we left this day, I wanted to make sure I said something about juries, because we talk about, we're so tired of the elites running our country, and of the elites here and the elites there. Well, the juries are not, quote, elites. They are us. And and they give such strength to our whole system. And I think we're really lucky in America that we embrace juries. And if we ever fail to do that, we will be in trouble.
Chad, before-
That's applause from an old trial lawyer. I want you to know.
Chad,
The-
before you start, the commercial part, the CLE number, particularly for those online, 174-281-761. Again, the number for your 1.5 CLE and 0.5 of ethics, 174-281-761. Chad.
So yes, you're right. It's hard to know the danger you're confronting. Oftentimes you don't understand it until it's too late, and it's easy to be alarmist in circumstances where you're not facing that danger. So I get very frustrated, candidly, at comparisons with Nazi Germany. I find them demeaning to the experience of my family. But as I tell people, here's the flip side. I mean, nobody's saying this is 1938 Germany, but before there was 1938, there was 1930, right? And it's real hard to tell when you're in 1930. One of the defining characteristics of 1930 definitely is good people not speaking up. Had good people spoken up earlier, it never would have happened. But it's hard, and I think where Vicki was wanting me to talk about was that, you know, my grandfather and my great uncle point up the problem. My great uncle took one look at Adolf Hitler and said, "Deuces, I'm going to Sweden." Like, he knew that man from day one and what he was about, and he left and was urging my grandfather for nearly a decade, "Ernst, get out of Germany, get out of Germany, get out of Germany." What are you talking about? It's a fad. He's not that bad. It'll blow over. You know, like, the country's too strong. Like, you're crazy, right? And then Kristallnacht happens, and it's like, oh, how's the weather in Sweden, right? And by then, of course, it's too late. And so it's a very concerning. I mean, for me, I'm always watching. I remember very vividly, I guess it was the early 90s, President Clinton, remember Bosnia and ethnic cleansing, and we were having this huge national debate about whether to go in militarily. And I was probably 24 years old, which meant I knew everything. My dad, the college professor, was probably my age, 60, and knew nothing. And I just remember at the dinner table being home one night and arguing with him, like, we can't go everywhere and save everyone. We can't do everything. And I remember he finally just put his fork down and said, "Well, all I can tell you is they came for me." That was the end of that argument. I guess the two things I would say about this as we all know what happens without the rule of law, and we all know what it's not an all or nothing thing. I'm not suggesting we're heading for, you know, a catastrophic end, but even minor effects on the rule of law have very real consequences for people. So even if that's not what we're talking about, we all need to be especially vigilant to maintain a robust rule of law. I think that means two things for me. You got to kind of be in everyone else's fight. Really believe that. One of the things I wonder about is, and I don't know the answer, it's one of the times I still wish I was coaching at Paul Quinn College. It's because I had such great discussions with my players down there. But, you know, I wonder if I were an African-American person, I would, at least to some degree, find some of this discussion a little bit hypocritical. Like, hey, there's been a large segment of my community that's lived a really long time without access to the rule of law, and I ain't heard you saying nothing about it, right? And now suddenly I'm supposed to join your fight. I don't know if there is any of that sentiment, but I know it would be natural for me if I was in the position to feel that way. So I think when we talk about protecting the rule of law, we should be focused not on protecting it for ourselves, but on protecting it for others. That was really my dad's number one takeaway from the Holocaust was, I'm not watching for me, and I'm not expecting anyone to, I'm watching for everyone else. I've got my eye on every group out there that could be damaged or suppressed or oppressed. And then the second takeaway for me, again, was my dad's great takeaway from the Holocaust. In spite of all that, I still believe people are good, right? Anne Frank, in spite of everything that happened, I still believe people are good. Now that maybe is the best takeaway. When you sit in a room like this, and you see the energy level of people and the interest of people, it reaffirms to me that in the end, we're going to be okay, I think. There's just too many good people in America for us not to be. But maybe that's Pollyanna-ish on my part, but that's how I feel.
Mm.
Good job.
Well, thank you so much for our panelists today. We do indeed have a little bit of time. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to put forward? We're going to go Thelma Clardy, and then we'll come to the gentleman in the front. Thelma. Thank you, Thelma. And also it should be noted that Thelma was the first African-American to serve on the DeSoto City Council. So Black female. So she continues the first in her family. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, it's a work in progress, and we're not there, but we got to keep at it. Right.
Right.
You got to keep at it.
Thank you, Thelma. And so your question, sir. So let me answer that as the president. And that has been the observation that we wanted to bring forums like this for the opportunity to share ideas. What the Dallas Bar has done is we continue to monitor the executive orders as they present themselves. We also have created a page online of various resources where you can engage to whatever your level of commitment is on the issue of resources. That way you'll know different organizations and how they are approaching it. The American Bar Association also has a robust list of resources and levels of engagement. So understanding that we are a bar association of 11,000 members with a variety on that spectrum of views, we want to give all of our members an opportunity to participate and engage on this topic, but we first have to understand what is it we're engaging about. So this is our role in providing education pieces and to provide resources. We've also signed a resolution that was part of our Law Day celebration, recognizing the importance of the rule of law and our support and recognition for the need of an independent judiciary and the separation of powers.
Can I add? So I want to add something to that. And first of all, let me just say, I thought it was wonderful that you began by saying that your political party had lost its marbles. I have no idea whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, having heard that statement. That's the world we're living in, right? One other thing you can do is litigate. I mean, there's a need out there for amicus support. And so that's something all of us can do. That's something I did a tremendous amount of during the pandemic. I mean, we filed a lot of amicus briefs in constitutional cases during the pandemic. So there's always a need for that. And that's something else to consider. I mean, nobody but us can do that.
You mean lawyers generally? Yes, sir.
But some, right, but some have said no deal. And I think those lawyers who have stood up for our profession, they're an example that I think will win the day. I actually think they'll win the day.
Well, I think they are.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's worth noting, is that seems to be leading all in one direction at this point.
So we have a question here, gentleman in the back, and then the lady in green.
Holston's a troublemaker.
Yes.
I don't know about it.
So the question is about the defunding of that will limit access to justice and legal services.
Well, I mean, it would be devastating if it happened. I think it's important to remember, and this is something I can speak to having served as a state bar officer, that, we have incredibly powerful, this is not a partisan issue. We have incredibly powerful conservative supporters of legal aid, both in the legislature and in the Congress. And, I'm just praying that they will be able to prevail on the president not to go down this path. And certainly, I should say, by the way, for those of you who don't know it, the single most influential figure in America in this movement is our former Chief Justice, who I'm hopeful will be spending a great deal of time in Washington in the coming months, because he's better at it than anybody.
And that's why it's.
Amen to that.
Oh, go ahead.
No.
Sir.
Right.
That's why it's significant that we have every year our Equal Access to Justice campaign that raises well over $1.2 million. And that's the gap as it currently exists, much less if there is defunding of the program. So the Dallas Bar has always played a significant role in supporting equal access to justice for our low-income citizens here in Dallas.
I'll tell you one quick story. Back in 1980, when there was a threat to legal services, I was a member of the El Paso Bar Association. We voted on ourselves to take 2 cases, the whole bar, out of our legal services operation. Every lawyer in El Paso took on 2 additional cases. So there are examples of lawyers really stepping up in meaningful ways to meet the demands of the day. So Bill, you're so wise to bring this subject up, but I've always been proud of El Paso, and that example still holds in El Paso 40 years later.
Thank you. Ma'am, your question. To repeat the question for those online, it is, what are the panelists' thoughts about the president sending troops, whether to California or to Texas, particularly when the governor has not requested it? And it is a question, interestingly, I did write down, as we were talking about separation of powers, but federal versus state authority, right? And we're speaking on the significance of the executive orders and the ability to reach down that far.
I just think we always hope that there will be a great deal of prudence involved whenever we send troops into civilian civilian enclaves of any kind. When there was a time, I don't remember when I was, I don't know, can't remember the dates, sometime in the 60s when we sent airborne troops into Detroit to quell riots. So there are examples of this happening in our history all over time, but always loved George H.W. Bush when he always said it's prudence. We got to hope for prudence, and he was a prudent man. That's not perhaps a good answer, but the use of troops in civilian affairs is a very delicate issue that needs to be considered very thoughtfully before being done. That's all I'd say.
Chad spoke earlier about the distinction between undermining the rule of law and violating the rule of law. That might be appropriate in this context as well. Does this really violate the law, or does it merely undermine it? And those two are, they might have some overlap, but they're distinct concepts.
Good point. Good point, Chad.
Well, I have grave concerns about the urban unrest in Alpine. Let me start there. LA is one thing, but Alpine, that's serious. There's a book I'll recommend to you. I don't have anything smarter than these guys for sure to add to what they said, but I'll recommend a book to you about this topic and probably the most famous use of troops in this type of situation, which was Ole Miss. A lot of people don't know that the federal government essentially invaded Mississippi because they sent the sheriff, the marshals down there, and the marshals got pinned down by hostile fire on the Ole Miss campus. And President Kennedy had to send in the National Guard. And the state of Mississippi met them at the border, barricaded the border with state troopers facing off against a United States Army tank. And a young lieutenant had the audacity to say, well, you got police cars and I got a tank. So you got 15 seconds. But the book's called An American Insurrection. And I think it's probably become very timely again. It's wildly entertaining, incredibly fascinating. On this topic, I would really recommend it.
There is a story about George Washington that I love. And his biographer said he was at a meeting that was one of the most important meetings to ever take place on American soil. We had won the war. We were still negotiating the peace, and the troops decided they would march on Philadelphia, the seat of government, and take it over because the Continental Congress had never, ever done what they said they would do to support the troops. And the troops said, you know, we got the guns, so we can go take it over. Washington heard about it and said, no, that can't happen. So he asked for a meeting. And this is from an indispensable man, one of his biographies. And he said, let me share with you a promise from the Continental Congress. And he said, I have it here in writing. And he took it out of his lapel and he said, but first, I just want you to know you can't do this. This is not what we fought for, and this cannot be done. We cannot have military intervention in our civilian life. It cannot be done. It's against everything we fought for. And he could tell the men weren't moved at all by his comments, not at all. And so finally he remembered the letter and he pulled it out and he said, but before I read this letter, let me put on my spectacles. He said, because I have grown not only old, but and gray, but almost blind in the service of my country. And after those words, the men disbanded because they understood the weight of what he was saying. And I always love that story about Washington, my favorite story about Washington, because that was in many ways, maybe the most important effort to make sure that there was never improper military intervention in American life. So thank you, because I get to tell that story that I love so much.
Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you all for joining us. 100 here in the room and over 200 online. We appreciate this, but we know this is just the beginning of the conversation. We are better aware, better armed, and we're going to be engaged. Thank you so much. We are dismissed.
Yeah. Yep.